He came home from war with a shattered leg, a purple heart, and a wife who had already emptied their bank account and moved in with his best friend. But the letter waiting in his mailbox would lead him to a forgotten bunker buried beneath American soil, and what he found inside would be worth more than $250 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning sun crept through the bent blinds of a studio apartment on the third floor of a building that should have been condemned years ago. The radiator clanked and hissed like it was fighting for its life. Somewhere down the hall, a baby cried. Somewhere outside, a car alarm wailed for the fourth time that week. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Wheeler sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing the scar tissue just below his left knee, waiting for the pain to quiet down enough for him to stand. He was 43 years old, 6'1", though he didn't stand as tall as he used to. His shoulders were still broad from years of military training, but they slumped now, curved inward like a man bracing for the next blow. His hair had gone grey at the temples sometime during his last deployment, and his eyes, once sharp and certain, had taken on the hollow look of someone who had stopped expecting good things. The apartment was small, one room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen. A hot plate on the counter, a mini fridge that hummed too loud, a single window that overlooked a brick wall. The only decoration was a framed photograph on the nightstand, a black and white image of a young man in a World War II uniform, standing straight and proud beside an American flag. His grandfather, the man who raised him. Marcus reached over and touched the edge of the frame, a habit he'd developed over the years. His grandfather had been gone for almost 2 decades now, but Marcus still talked to him sometimes late at night when the silence got too heavy. He figured if anyone could hear him from the other side, it would be the old man who taught him how to throw a punch, fix an engine, and never, under any circumstances, break his word. "Still here, Grandpa," Marcus muttered. "Barely." He grabbed the cane leaning against the wall and pulled himself up. The pain shot from his knee to his hip, hot and sharp, but he was used to it. 3 years since the IED took out the Humvee. 3 years since the field surgeons rebuilt his leg with metal rods and prayers. He was lucky to be alive. That's what they told him. Lucky. He limped to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, and stared at the man in the mirror. He didn't recognize him anymore. Somewhere between Kandahar and this crumbling apartment, he had become a ghost of the soldier he used to be. His phone buzzed on the counter. He ignored it. Probably another scam call. Maybe the VA rescheduling his physical therapy appointment again. Or maybe it was one of the creditors he'd been dodging for months, calling to remind him that the bills didn't care about his service record. He made instant coffee with water from the tap and sat at the small folding table by the window. The coffee tasted like rust and regret, but it was hot, and that was enough. Marcus Wheeler had served 21 years in the United States Army. He had deployed 4 times. He had earned medals, commendations, a Bronze Star with Valor, and a Purple Heart. He had led men into firefights and carried them out when they couldn't walk. He had done everything right, and none of it mattered. Because while he was lying in a hospital bed in Germany, his body broken and his future uncertain, his wife, the woman he had loved since high school, the woman he had married in a small church in Ohio, the woman he had trusted with everything, had been draining their joint accounts. She had sold the house, she had taken the truck, and by the time he was stable enough to call home, she was already living with his best friend, a man named Kevin. A man who had stood beside him at their wedding. A man who had promised to look after things while Marcus was overseas. They looked after things, all right. They looked after themselves. Marcus didn't fight it. By the time he got back to the States, there was nothing left to fight for. The divorce papers were signed before his leg was fully healed. He walked out of that marriage with a duffel bag, a cane, and a bitterness he couldn't shake no matter how hard he tried. That was 2 years ago. Now he lived alone, He worked odd jobs when his leg allowed, fixing appliances for the elderly couple down the hall, helping a mechanic friend on the other side of town when they needed an extra set of hands. He collected his disability check, stretched every dollar like it was made of rubber, and tried not to think about the life he used to have. He finished his coffee and stood slowly. Today was Tuesday, which meant it was physical therapy at the VA clinic across town. The bus ride took 45 minutes each way, and the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and despair, but it was routine. Routine kept him sane. He grabbed his jacket, checked his pockets for his keys and wallet, and opened the door. A white envelope sat on the floor just outside his apartment. Marcus stared at it. No one sent him mail. Not anymore. His mother had passed when he was 12. His father had disappeared long before that. He had no siblings, no cousins he kept in touch with. His grandfather's brother, some great-uncle he had never met, had been the last of the family, and even he was just a name in old letters, a faded face in photographs from a war that ended decades before Marcus was born. He bent down carefully, his knees screaming in protest, and picked up the envelope. It was heavy, official-looking. The return address was from a law firm in Pennsylvania, Brennan, Lockwood and Associates. Marcus frowned. He didn't know anyone in Pennsylvania. He stepped back inside, closed the door, and sat down at the table again. He turned the envelope over in his hands, half expecting it to be a mistake. Wrong address, wrong person, wrong life. But his name was printed clearly on the front, Marcus James Wheeler. He opened it. Inside was a letter, typed on thick legal stationery. The language was formal, stuffed with phrases like hereby notified and pursuant to the estate. But the message itself was simple enough. His great-uncle had died. The old man, his grandfather's younger brother, a man named Harold Wheeler, had passed away 6 months ago at the age of 97. He had lived alone on a rural property in the hills of western Pennsylvania, a recluse who rarely spoke to anyone and never left his land. There were no other heirs. The rest of the family had either passed or declined the inheritance. Marcus was the last living relative willing to accept. He read the next paragraph 3 times to make sure he understood. The estate included a 47-acre property, a farmhouse, and, according to the lawyer's careful wording, a secondary structure of historical significance. Marcus had no idea what that meant, but there was more. The letter explained that the property had sat untouched since Harold's death. The lawyer had attempted to contact Marcus several times through outdated addresses and disconnected phone numbers. This letter was a final attempt before the estate was turned over to the state. At the bottom of the page, a handwritten note had been added in neat slanted script. Mr. Wheeler, your great-uncle left specific instructions that you, and only you, should inherit this property. He believed you would understand what to do with it. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience. Marcus sat back in his chair, staring at the letter. He barely remembered Harold. A few stories from his grandfather told late at night on the porch after a few beers. Harold had served in World War II just like their grandfather. He had been part of some kind of special unit, intelligence maybe, or recovery operations. The details were always vague. Harold came home different, his grandfather used to say, quieter, like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. After the war, Harold had bought land in the middle of nowhere and disappeared from family life almost entirely. He sent Christmas cards for a few years, then stopped. He attended exactly one family reunion in 1973, said almost nothing, and left before dessert. That was the last time anyone saw him. And now, somehow, he had left everything to Marcus. The letter included a key, old, brass, heavy, taped to a separate card with an address written beneath it. Marcus held the key in his palm. It was cold against his skin. He didn't believe in fate, not anymore. But something about this felt different. Something about this felt like the universe was offering him a door, and all he had to do was walk through it. He picked up his phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. A woman answered on the third ring. Her voice was professional, polished, the kind of voice that belonged in a courtroom. "Brennan, Lockwood and Associates, how may I direct your call?" Marcus cleared his throat. Yeah. My name is Marcus Wheeler. I got a letter about an inheritance." "From a Harold Wheeler?" A pause. The sound of typing. "Mr. Wheeler, yes. We've been trying to reach you for months. I'm glad you called." "Yeah, well, I've moved around a lot." "I understand. Let me transfer you to Mr. Brennan. He handled your great-uncle's estate personally." There was a click, a moment of silence, and then a man's voice came on the line, older, measured, with the careful diction of someone who chose every word deliberately. "Mr. Wheeler, this is Thomas Brennan. Thank you for getting in touch." "What exactly did my uncle leave me?" Brennan paused. "Your great-uncle was a private man, Mr. Wheeler. Very private. He lived alone on that property for over 50 years. Never married. No children. Very few visitors." "I gathered that. What he left behind is unusual. I've handled many estates in my career, but nothing quite like this." Marcus frowned. "Unusual how?" "I think it would be best if you saw it for yourself. The property is in the township of Ridgewood, about 3 hours west of Pittsburgh. There's a farmhouse, mostly in disrepair, but the structure your uncle referenced in his will, that's something else entirely." "What kind of structure?" Brennan hesitated. "A bunker, Mr. Wheeler, built sometime during or shortly after the war. Your great-uncle never allowed anyone inside. He had it sealed, locked, and guarded for decades. We've never been able to access it ourselves." Marcus looked down at the brass key in his palm. "But you have the key now," Brennan continued, "and according to your uncle's instructions, you're the only one authorized to open it." That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the key resting on his chest like a weight he couldn't explain. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind drifted to places he didn't want to go. The explosion, the hospital, the empty house he came home to, the look on Kevin's face when Marcus finally confronted him. He remembered that conversation like it happened yesterday. Kevin standing in the doorway of the home that used to belong to Marcus, arms crossed, eyes hard. "She was lonely, man. You were gone. What did you expect?" Marcus hadn't hit him, not because he didn't want to, but because his leg gave out before he could take the swing. He ended up on his knees in the front yard of his own house, gasping for breath while his ex-wife watched from the window and his best friend walked back inside without another word. That was the last time he saw either of them. He sat up now, swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. His knee throbbed. The clock on the wall read 3:15 in the morning. Sleep wasn't coming. Not tonight. He limped to the window and looked out at the city below. Streetlights flickered. A siren wailed somewhere in the distance. The world kept moving, indifferent to the broken men it left behind. He thought about the bunker, about his great-uncle, about the strange weight of that brass key. What had Harold been hiding all those years? What was so important that he sealed it away and never let anyone near it? And why, out of everyone in the world, had he chosen Marcus? The next morning, Marcus made a decision. He called the physical therapy clinic and cancelled his appointment. Then he called his landlord and said he'd be gone for a few days, maybe longer. The landlord didn't care. Rent was paid through the end of the month. After that, it wasn't his problem. Marcus packed light, one duffel bag, a few changes of clothes, his medications, a flashlight, a knife, and the key. He didn't own a car, couldn't afford one, so he bought a bus ticket to Pittsburgh, then rented the cheapest vehicle he could find, a beat-up Ford pickup with a cracked windshield and a tape deck that only played static. The drive west took 4 hours. The landscape changed slowly, shifting from city sprawl to farmland to rolling hills thick with trees. The roads narrowed. The towns grew smaller. By the time he reached Ridgewood Township, he hadn't seen another car in 20 minutes. The address led him down a dirt road that wound through dense forest, climbing higher into the hills. Branches scraped the sides of the truck. Potholes rattled his teeth. Twice he had to stop and check the map on his phone to make sure he hadn't taken a wrong turn. And then, finally, he saw it. The farmhouse sat at the edge of a wide clearing, surrounded by waist-high weeds and rusted farm equipment. It was 2 stories, wood-framed, with a sagging porch and broken windows. The roof had caved in on one side. The front door hung open, swinging gently in the breeze. Marcus parked the truck and stepped out slowly, leaning on his cane. The air was cool and clean, sharp with the smell of pine and wet earth. Birds called from the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a creek babbled over stones. He stood there for a long moment, taking it all in. This was his now. 47 acres of forest and silence, a crumbling house, and whatever secrets lay buried beneath. He walked toward the farmhouse first, moving carefully over the uneven ground. The porch steps groaned under his weight. Inside, the place was a ruin, furniture overturned, wallpaper peeling, animal droppings scattered across the floor. It smelled like mold and decay, the air thick with dust. But there were signs that someone had lived here once. A coat still hung on a hook by the door. Dishes sat in the sink, crusted with something unidentifiable. Photographs lined the mantel above a fireplace choked with ash. Marcus picked up one of the photographs. It showed 2 young men in military uniforms standing side by side in front of an army jeep. He recognized his grandfather immediately, the same photograph he kept on his nightstand, just from a different angle. The other man had to be Harold, younger, leaner, with the same sharp eyes and stubborn jaw. He set the photograph down gently. "What happened to you, Uncle Harold?" he murmured. "What did you see?" He searched the rest of the house but found nothing unusual, just the remnants of a solitary life, frozen in time. Old newspapers from the 1980s, canned goods that had expired decades ago. A radio that probably hadn't worked since the Cold War, but there was no bunker, no hidden door, no sign of anything worth hiding. Marcus stepped back outside and scanned the property. The lawyer had said the bunker was a secondary structure separate from the farmhouse, somewhere on the land. He started walking. The clearing gave way to forest, and the forest swallowed him whole. He followed what looked like an old path, overgrown but still visible if you knew where to look. His knee screamed with every step, but he pushed through it. He'd walked through worse pain. He'd crawled through worse. After about 15 minutes, he found it. At first, it looked like nothing, just a mound of earth covered in ivy and fallen leaves. But as he got closer, he saw the concrete underneath, and the steel door, rusted but solid, set into the hillside like the entrance to a tomb. Marcus stopped. His heart pounded. This was it. He approached slowly, brushing away the vines and debris. The door was heavy, industrial, the kind of thing you'd find on a military installation. There were no markings, no signs, just a single keyhole in the center, brass, weathered with age. He pulled out the key. His hands trembled, not from fear, not exactly, but from something else. Anticipation, maybe. Or the weight of 47 acres of silence pressing down on him, waiting for him to unlock whatever truth had been buried here. He inserted the key. It fit perfectly. He turned it. The lock clicked, and the door, sealed for God knows how many decades, groaned open, releasing a rush of cold, stale air that smelled like oil and old metal, and something else he couldn't name. Marcus stood at the threshold, flashlight in hand, staring into the darkness below. Stone steps led down, disappearing into the black. He didn't hesitate. He stepped inside. The descent was slow. The stairs were narrow, carved from concrete and worn smooth from years of use. Marcus kept one hand on the wall, the other gripping his flashlight so tight his knuckles turned white. The air grew colder with every step. The silence was absolute. No birds, no wind, no world. just the sound of his boots and the steady thump of his cane against stone. At the bottom, the passage opened into a corridor. Concrete walls, low ceiling, pipes running along the top, rusted but intact. It looked like something out of a war movie, a command bunker maybe, or a fallout shelter from the Cold War. But it was older than that. Marcus could feel it. He moved forward, sweeping his flashlight from side to side. The corridor stretched on for what felt like 100 feet before ending at another door. This one, steel, painted military green, with a wheel handle like you'd find on a submarine. Marcus grabbed the wheel and turned. It resisted at first, decades of rust fighting back. But he was stronger than he looked, and after a moment, the wheel gave. The door swung inward, and what he saw on the other side stopped him cold. It was a room, a massive room, at least 40 feet wide and twice as long, with ceilings high enough to echo. The walls were lined with shelves, cabinets, crates stacked floor to ceiling. Old military equipment, radios, uniforms, helmets, sat on display like museum pieces. Maps hung on every surface, some yellowed with age, others still bright, marked with pins and notes and strategic symbols he didn't recognize. But that wasn't what made him freeze. In the center of the room, under a bare bulb that flickered to life when he flipped a switch near the door, sat a long wooden table covered in documents, ledgers, and sealed folders stamped with words that made his blood run cold. Classified, top secret. And at the far end of the room, behind a wall of glass cases and velvet-lined displays, he saw it. Gold, bars of it, stacked neatly in rows, glinting under the flickering light like something out of a fever dream. Beside them, trays of coins, jewelry, watches, rings, a painting in an ornate frame covered in dust but unmistakably old. Another painting beside it, and another. Marcus's legs gave out. He sank to his knees on the cold concrete floor, staring at a fortune he couldn't comprehend. His hands shook as he crawled forward, pulling himself toward the table in the center of the room. There, resting on top of the documents, was a single envelope, handwritten, addressed to him. He opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter, written in the same neat, slanted script as the note from the lawyer. Dear Marcus, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I spent my life protecting. I served in the war, just like your grandfather. But my unit was different. We were tasked with recovering what the Nazis stole: art, gold, heirlooms, treasures looted from families across Europe. We were supposed to return it all. But the war ended too fast. The bureaucracy failed, and too many of the men in charge cared more about power than justice. I couldn't let that happen, so I hid what I could. I brought it here. I kept it safe. I am not a thief. I never spent a single coin, never sold a single piece. I was waiting for the right person to finish what I started. I believe that person is you. You have your grandfather's heart. I saw it in you, even when you were a boy. You know what honor means. You know what sacrifice means. Now you must decide what to do with this burden. Some of it is yours to keep, war trophies legally obtained, but much of it belongs to others, families who lost everything, descendants who never knew what was taken from them. Find them, return what was stolen. And maybe, in doing so, you will find something that was stolen from you too. Your great-uncle Harold. Marcus sat on the cold floor of the bunker for a long time, the letter resting in his lap, his eyes fixed on the gold glinting in the distance. He thought about his grandfather, about the stories of honor and duty he had grown up hearing, about the man who taught him that your word was the only thing you truly owned in this world. He thought about the betrayal, the wife who left, the friend who took everything, the life that had crumbled while he was lying in a hospital bed 6,000 miles away. And he thought about this impossible gift, this burden, this chance, $250 million buried beneath the Pennsylvania hills, hidden for decades, waiting for him. He could walk away, sell it all, disappear, start over somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew his name. But that wasn't who he was. That wasn't who his grandfather raised him to be. Marcus Wheeler pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on his cane. His knee throbbed, his back ached, his heart pounded like a drum in his chest. But for the first time in years, maybe for the first time since the explosion, he felt something stir inside him. Purpose. He looked around the room one more time, at the gold and the paintings and the documents stamped with secrets. Then he folded the letter carefully, slipped it into his pocket, and walked back toward the light. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He drove back to the nearest town, a forgotten place called Millbrook, population 800 and shrinking, and checked into the only motel that still had a working vacancy sign. The room smelled like mildew and cigarette smoke from a decade ago, but it had a bed, a shower, and a lock on the door. That was enough. He sat on the edge of the mattress, still wearing his boots, still covered in dust from the bunker. His cane leaned against the nightstand. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. $250 million. He kept turning the number over in his mind like a stone he couldn't put down. It didn't feel real. None of it felt real. 12 hours ago, he had been sitting in a crumbling apartment, drinking instant coffee and wondering how he was going to make rent. Now he was the sole owner of a fortune most people couldn't imagine in 100 lifetimes. But it wasn't the money that kept him awake. It was the letter. Harold's words echoed in his head like a voice from another world. Find them, return what was stolen, and maybe in doing so you will find something that was stolen from you too. Marcus pulled the letter from his pocket and read it again, then again. Each time, the weight of it pressed harder against his chest. His great-uncle had spent 50 years guarding this secret. 50 years of silence, solitude, and sacrifice. He had never married, never had children, never left that property except to buy supplies and pay taxes. He had given his entire life to protecting something he believed was too important to abandon. And now that responsibility had passed to Marcus. He thought about the gold bars stacked behind glass, the paintings covered in dust, the jewelry and coins and documents stamped with classifications that hadn't been used since the 1940s. He thought about the families Harold mentioned, people who had lost everything during the war, descendants who had no idea their grandparents' treasures were sitting in a bunker in rural Pennsylvania. He thought about what it would mean to find them, to return what had been taken, to do what the governments and bureaucracies had failed to do for 80 years. It was impossible. It was insane. It was the kind of thing that happened in movies, not in the life of a broken-down veteran with a bum leg and a bank account that barely covered groceries. But Marcus had never been the kind of man who walked away from a mission. He set the letter on the nightstand, lay back on the bed, and stared at the water-stained ceiling until the first grey light of dawn crept through the curtains. Then he got up, grabbed his cane, and drove back to the bunker. The morning air was crisp and cold, heavy with the smell of pine and wet earth. Marcus parked the truck at the edge of the clearing and sat for a moment, watching mist curl through the trees like smoke. The farmhouse looked even worse in daylight, a skeleton of rotting wood and broken glass, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. But he wasn't here for the farmhouse. He followed the path back to the bunker entrance, moving slower this time, taking in details he had missed the night before. The concrete was military grade, poured thick and reinforced with steel. The door was the kind of thing you'd find on a government installation. Blast-resistant, weatherproof, built to last a century. Whoever designed this place had expected it to survive anything. Marcus opened the door and descended the stone steps again. The cold air wrapped around him like a blanket. The silence pressed against his ears. By the time he reached the bottom, his knee was screaming, but he pushed through it. Pain was an old friend. He knew how to ignore it. The corridor stretched out before him, lit now by the bare bulbs he had switched on the night before. He moved past the first door and into the main chamber, where the treasure waited in the flickering half-light. It looked different in the morning, less like a fever dream, more like a museum. The crates and shelves and display cases formed neat rows, organized with military precision. Labels had been affixed to some of them, handwritten in Harold's neat script, faded with age, but still legible. Marcus walked the perimeter slowly, reading each label, trying to understand the scope of what he was seeing. The first section contained what Harold had called recovery items, verified provenance. These were the things that could be traced back to specific owners: paintings with gallery stamps on the back, jewelry with family crests engraved on the clasps, documents with names and addresses written in the margins. Each item had a corresponding folder in a filing cabinet nearby, stuffed with photographs, receipts, and handwritten notes detailing where it had been found and who it had likely belonged to. Marcus pulled one folder at random. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in 1930s clothing, standing in front of a grand house somewhere in Europe. Behind her, mounted on the wall, was a painting, a landscape of rolling hills and a distant church spire. The same painting now sat in a velvet-lined case 3 feet away from where Marcus stood. He flipped through the documents. The woman's name was Eva Steinberg. She had lived in Vienna before the war. According to Harold's notes, her entire family had been taken to the camps in 1942. The painting had been seized by Nazi officers and shipped to Berlin. Harold's unit had recovered it from a salt mine in 1945. Marcus closed the folder, his throat tight. There were hundreds of folders like this, maybe thousands. Each one a life interrupted, each one a family torn apart by history. He moved deeper into the bunker. The next section was larger, more complex. Crates stacked floor to ceiling, some still sealed with their original military markings. Marcus pried one open and found it filled with gold coins, French francs, German marks, Swiss currency, each one wrapped in paper and catalogued with a small identification number. Another crate held silver candlesticks, menorahs, religious artifacts. A third contained stacks of old currency, bundled and tied with string. This was the wealth that had been stripped from families across Europe. Bank accounts emptied, safe deposit boxes raided, homes ransacked while their owners were marched to trains headed east. Harold had spent decades documenting it all, organizing it, preserving it for a day when it could finally be returned. Marcus felt a wave of emotion crash over him, grief and anger and something else he couldn't name. These weren't just objects, they were memories, proof that people had lived, had loved, had built lives that the war had tried to erase, and they had been waiting here, in the darkness, for 80 years. He wiped his eyes and kept moving. At the far end of the main chamber, past the display cases and filing cabinets, he found a heavy steel door he hadn't noticed the night before. This one was different from the others, newer, reinforced, with a combination lock instead of a key. Marcus frowned. Harold's letter hadn't mentioned a second vault. He studied the lock, trying to imagine what combination a 97-year-old recluse might have chosen. Dates were the obvious guess: birthdays, anniversaries, significant moments. But Marcus didn't know Harold's birthday, didn't know if he had ever married or had children. Then he remembered something, a detail from his grandfather's stories shared on the porch late at night when the old man's tongue had been loosened by bourbon. Harold had landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the beginning of the end of the war in Europe. Marcus punched in the numbers 060619444. The lock clicked open. He pulled the door wide and stepped inside. This room was smaller than the main chamber, maybe 20 feet by 30, but what it contained made Marcus's breath catch in his throat. The walls were covered with maps, not just any maps. Strategic military maps from the Second World War, marked with pins and annotations in multiple languages. Some showed troop movements across France and Germany. Others detailed supply routes, railway lines, communication networks. One entire wall was dedicated to a massive map of Central Europe covered in red circles and handwritten notes. But that wasn't what made Marcus stare. In the center of the room, mounted on a raised platform, was a scale model of something. A complex, a compound, a network of buildings surrounded by fences and guard towers. It took him a moment to recognize what he was looking at. A concentration camp. The model was incredibly detailed. Barracks, administrative buildings, rail lines leading in and out. Small figures represented guards and prisoners. Everything was labeled in German, with Harold's English translations penciled beneath. Marcus circled the model slowly, his stomach churning. On a table beside it, he found more documents. These were different from the ones in the main chamber, not inventories of stolen goods, but intelligence reports, briefings, debriefs, photographs of officers in Nazi uniforms, some with red X marks drawn through their faces. Harold hadn't just been recovering stolen treasure. He had been tracking the men who stole it. Marcus picked up one of the photographs. It showed a man in his 40s, sharp-featured, wearing the uniform of an SS officer. On the back, Harold had written, Major Hans Gruber, Treasury Division, responsible for seizures in Vienna and Budapest. Whereabouts after 1945 unknown. There were dozens of photographs like this, maybe hundreds, each one annotated with names, dates, crimes committed, and, in many cases, the word escaped. Marcus sank into a chair beside the table, his mind reeling. His great-uncle hadn't just been a soldier. He had been a hunter. For 50 years, he had tracked the men who had stolen these treasures, documented their crimes, and, when he could, recovered what they had taken. But he had never brought them to justice, never gone public with what he knew, never exposed the networks of corruption and complicity that had allowed these men to escape. Why? Marcus rifled through more documents until he found what looked like a personal journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded, but Harold's handwriting was still legible. He opened to a random page. March 15, 1953. Received confirmation that Gruber is living in Argentina under an assumed name. Filed report with proper authorities. No response. Third report this year, beginning to understand that some men are protected by powers greater than justice. Marcus turned to another page. November 8, 1961. Attempted to contact journalist in New York. Warned that publication of my findings would endanger my life and the lives of my sources. Decided to wait. The time is not right. And another. July 22nd, 1979. I am an old man now. The war criminals I hunted are dying of natural causes unpunished. The governments that were supposed to seek justice have chosen convenience instead. I have failed. All I can do now is protect what remains and hope that someone someday will finish what I started. Marcus closed the journal. The weight of it pressed down on him like a physical force. His great-uncle had spent his entire life fighting a battle the world had abandoned. He had sacrificed everything, family, connection, the simple pleasures of ordinary life, to guard a truth that no one wanted to hear. And now that truth belonged to Marcus. He sat in the map room for a long time, surrounded by ghosts. What happens next will turn this story upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. By the time Marcus emerged from the bunker, the sun had crossed to the other side of the sky. His leg throbbed, his back ached, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. He had a mission now, a purpose, something worth fighting for. But he couldn't do it alone. He drove back to Millbrook and parked outside the small public library, a single-story building with a faded sign and windows that looked like they hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. Inside, an elderly woman sat behind a desk, reading a paperback romance novel and sipping tea from a chipped mug. She looked up when Marcus walked in. Help you? I need to use a computer, Marcus said, and maybe pick your brain about local history. The woman raised an eyebrow. You're not from around here. No, ma'am, but I just inherited the Wheeler property up in the hills. Her expression shifted, curiosity mixing with something else. Wariness, maybe, or respect. Harold Wheeler's place. Yes, ma'am. She set down her book. That man was a mystery, lived out there alone for as long as anyone can remember. Never caused trouble, but never made friends either. Folks around here used to say he was hiding something. Marcus smiled faintly. They were right. He spent the next 3 hours at the library's single public computer, researching everything he could find about Nazi art theft, post-war recovery efforts, and restitution organizations. The more he read, the more he understood the scope of what his great-uncle had been dealing with. The Nazis had stolen an estimated 600,000 pieces of art during the war, along with billions of dollars in gold, currency, and personal property. After the war, Allied forces had recovered some of it, but much had disappeared into private collections, black markets, and the vaults of corrupt officials. To this day, thousands of families were still searching for heirlooms that had been taken from their ancestors. There were organizations dedicated to this work: the World Jewish Restitution Organization, the Art Loss Register, various government agencies in Europe and the United States. But the process was slow, bureaucratic, and often unsuccessful. Many families had given up. Marcus printed out contact information for a dozen organizations and shoved the papers into his jacket pocket. He also searched for information about his great-uncle's military unit. The details were scarce. Most records from that era were still classified or had been lost, but he found a few references to something called the Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives Program, nicknamed the Monuments Men. These were the soldiers and scholars who had been tasked with protecting cultural treasures during the war and recovering what the Nazis had stolen. Harold's name didn't appear in any of the public records, but based on the documents in the bunker, Marcus was certain he had been part of something similar, maybe an offshoot, maybe a classified operation that had never been acknowledged. Whatever it was, Harold had taken his mission seriously, more seriously than anyone had ever known. That night, Marcus sat in his motel room with a legal pad and a pen, making lists. First, he needed to inventory everything in the bunker, not just a rough count, but a detailed catalogue, photographs, descriptions, provenance information. He would need to cross-reference Harold's files with the databases maintained by restitution organizations, looking for matches. Second, he needed legal advice. The moment he went public with this discovery, there would be questions about ownership, about taxes, about chain of custody. He needed a lawyer who specialized in this kind of thing, someone who understood international law and historical claims. Third, he needed help. Physical help. There was no way he could do all of this alone, not with his leg, not with his limited resources. He needed people he could trust. That last part was the hardest. Marcus had learned the cost of trust the hard way. The people he had believed in most, his wife, his best friend, had betrayed him when he was at his weakest. The idea of letting anyone else into his life, into this secret, made his stomach clench. But he couldn't do this alone. Harold had tried that. He had spent 50 years in isolation, guarding his treasure, waiting for the right moment. And in the end, he had died without finishing his mission. Marcus wouldn't make the same mistake. He thought about who he could call. His contacts from the military were mostly scattered, reassigned, or retired. His family was gone. His friends, well, he didn't have friends anymore. Not really. But there was one person, someone he had served with in Afghanistan. A woman named Patricia Cole, everyone called her Cole, who had been a military intelligence officer before transitioning to private consulting. She was sharp, discreet, and one of the few people Marcus had ever met who seemed completely incapable of dishonesty. They had lost touch after Marcus's injury, But he still had her number. At least he hoped he did. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Her name was still there. He hesitated. It was after 11 at night. Calling now would seem desperate. But maybe desperate was exactly what he was. He pressed the call button. She answered on the fourth ring. "Wheeler, is that you?" Her voice was exactly the same, steady, calm, with a hint of humor underneath, like nothing in the world could truly surprise her. "Yeah, it's me. Sorry to call so late." "Don't be. I was just watching terrible television and questioning my life choices. What's going on?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I need help, and I don't really know how to explain why." There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted, serious now, professional. "I'm listening." Marcus told her everything. The letter, the inheritance, the bunker, the treasure, the documents. He told her about Harold's mission and the decades of silence. He told her about the gold and the paintings and the journals filled with names of men who had escaped justice. When he finished, the line was quiet for a long moment. Then Cole let out a low whistle. "You're not joking." "I wish I was." $250 million in a bunker in Pennsylvania, left to you by a great-uncle you never met. That's the situation. Another pause. "And you want to give it back?" "The stuff that was stolen, yeah. The rest, I don't know. I haven't figured that part out yet." Cole laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Wheeler, you're either the most honorable man I've ever met or the dumbest. Maybe both." "Probably both." "All right, I'm in." Marcus blinked. "Just like that?" "Just like that. I've spent the last 3 years doing corporate security for tech bros who wouldn't know a moral compass if it hit them in the face. You're offering me a chance to do something that actually matters. When do we start?" Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't even realized he was carrying. "How soon can you get to Pennsylvania?" "I'll be there Thursday." True to her word, Cole arrived on Thursday. She pulled up to the motel in a black SUV, stepped out wearing tactical pants and a leather jacket, and surveyed the parking lot like she was assessing potential threats. Which, knowing Cole, she probably was. She hadn't changed much since Afghanistan. Same close-cropped hair, same sharp eyes, same way of moving that made you think she could handle anything the world threw at her. Marcus met her in the parking lot, leaning on his cane. "You look like hell," she said. "Nice to see you too." She smiled, a rare thing for Cole, and pulled him into a brief, tight hug. "Let's see this bunker." The drive out to the property took 20 minutes. Marcus filled her in on the details he had learned since their phone call. The layout of the bunker, the filing system Harold had created, the map room with its intelligence documents and photographs. Cole listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. When they finally descended into the bunker, she stopped at the entrance to the main chamber and stared. "Holy hell! Yeah." She walked the perimeter slowly, examining everything with the practiced eye of an intelligence professional. She opened crates, flipped through folders, studied the filing system. She spent a long time in the map room, reading Harold's journal and examining the scale model of the concentration camp. When she finally emerged, her face was pale. "Wheeler, do you understand what you have here?" "I'm starting to. This isn't just stolen treasure. This is evidence. Intelligence that was never made public. Names of war criminals who escaped prosecution. Documentation of networks that helped them disappear." She shook her head. "Your great-uncle wasn't just collecting art. He was building a case against people who were supposed to be our allies." Marcus nodded slowly. "I figured that out." "And you still want to go public with this?" "I want to return what was stolen. I want to honor what Harold spent his life protecting. Beyond that, I don't know yet." Cole stared at him for a long moment. "You know there are people who will not want this information to come out. Powerful people, governments, corporations, families who built fortunes on stolen wealth. The moment you start making noise, you'll have targets on your back. I've had targets on my back before. Not like this. This isn't a firefight, Wheeler. This is politics. Money, old money. The kind that doesn't play by any rules. Marcus met her eyes. Then I guess I'll need someone who knows how to play dirty. Cole smiled. A cold, dangerous smile. Now you're speaking my language. They spent the next 3 days cataloging. Marcus handled the physical inventory, opening crates, photographing items, recording descriptions in a notebook. Cole tackled the documents, scanning Harold's files, organizing the intelligence reports, creating digital backups of everything. They worked 16-hour days, stopping only to eat and sleep. By the end of the 3rd day, they had a rough count of the bunker's contents. The art collection alone was staggering. Over 200 paintings, including works by masters whose names Marcus recognized from museum visits years ago: Monet, Renoir, Klimt, Picasso. Many had been reported stolen during the war and were still listed in international databases. A few had been considered lost forever. The gold and currency totaled approximately $90 million at current market value. The jewelry and personal effects, wedding rings, watches, religious items, were harder to value, but Cole estimated another 20 to 30 million. And then there were the documents. Harold's files contained evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted, names of Nazi officers who had escaped to South America, the Middle East, the United States, records of Swiss bank accounts that had never been investigated, correspondence with government officials who had buried reports, lost evidence, looked the other way. "This is a bomb," Cole said on the 3rd night, sitting across from Marcus in the motel room, surrounded by stacks of paper. "If we release this, it will explode across every major news outlet in the world. Governments will fall, fortunes will collapse, people will go to prison." "Good." Cole raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Because once this is out, there's no putting it back. You'll be famous, or infamous. Either way, your life will never be the same." Marcus thought about his apartment back in the city. The water-stained ceiling, the rattling radiator, the photograph of his grandfather on the nightstand. "My life hasn't been the same since I stepped on that IED," he said quietly. "At least this time, the explosion will be on my terms." Cole studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "All right. Then we do this right. We find the best lawyers, the most reputable restitution organizations, the journalists who can't be bought. We build a team, we document everything. And when we're ready, we go public in a way that can't be ignored or buried." Marcus extended his hand. "Partners?" Cole shook it firmly. "Partners." The next morning, Marcus drove into town alone. He needed supplies, food, batteries, more notebooks, but he also needed to think. He parked outside the general store and sat in the truck for a moment, watching the quiet street. Millbrook was the kind of town that time had forgotten. Storefronts that hadn't changed since the 1950s. Pickup trucks older than he was. Elderly residents moving slowly, nodding to each other, carrying on conversations that had probably been going for decades. It reminded him of the town where he grew up, before the army, before the war, before everything. He stepped out of the truck and headed for the store. Inside, a man in his 60s stood behind the counter, reading a newspaper and smoking a cigarette despite the no smoking sign on the wall. "Help you?" "Just picking up some supplies." The man nodded and went back to his newspaper. Marcus gathered what he needed: canned food, bottled water, flashlight batteries, a new notebook, and brought it to the counter. As the man rang him up, he glanced at Marcus with something like curiosity. "You're the one who bought the Wheeler place." Word travels fast. Small town, not much else to talk about. The man bagged the supplies. "You planning to fix it up? Sell it?" "Haven't decided yet." The man studied him for a moment. "You know, people used to say old Harold was crazy, thought he was hiding something up there, some kind of treasure." Marcus kept his expression neutral. "People say a lot of things." "They do." The man handed him the bag. "But sometimes they're right." Marcus paid and left without another word. As he walked to his truck, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. A black sedan parked at the far end of the street, tinted windows, out-of-state plates. He climbed into the truck but didn't start the engine. Instead, he watched the sedan in his rearview mirror. After a moment, the sedan pulled away and disappeared around a corner. Marcus sat there for a long time, his heart beating just a little faster than normal. Cole was right. The moment they started making noise, they would have targets on their backs. It looked like someone had already started paying attention. Marcus told Cole about the sedan that same night. They were sitting in the bunker's map room, surrounded by documents and photographs, the bare bulb overhead casting harsh shadows across the walls. Cole listened without interrupting, her expression growing darker with each detail. "Black sedan, tinted windows, out-of-state plates," she repeated. "You get the plate number?" "Partial, started with 37. "That's not much to go on." "I know." Cole leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Could be nothing. Could be a tourist passing through. Could be a real estate developer scoping out properties." "Could be," Marcus agreed, "but it didn't feel like nothing." "Your gut?" "My gut says someone's watching." Cole nodded slowly. "Then we assume the worst and plan accordingly. From now on, we vary our routes. We don't keep a predictable schedule, and we start thinking about security for this place." Marcus looked around the bunker, the steel doors, the reinforced walls, the decades of secrecy. Harold managed to keep this hidden for 50 years. Harold wasn't trying to go public. We are. Cole stood and walked to the map of Central Europe, studying the pins and annotations. "The moment we start contacting restitution organizations, reaching out to journalists, filing legal paperwork, we're putting up a signal flare. Anyone who's been watching, waiting, hoping this stuff would stay buried forever, they'll know." "You think there are people like that, after 80 years? Cole turned to face him. "Wheeler, there are fortunes built on stolen Nazi gold, museums filled with looted art, families who inherited wealth they never questioned, governments that made deals with war criminals in exchange for intelligence during the Cold War." She shook her head. "There are a lot of people with a lot to lose if the truth comes out, and some of them have been waiting a very long time to make sure it doesn't." Marcus absorbed that. He had known on some level that this wouldn't be simple, but hearing Cole lay it out so clearly made the danger feel real in a way it hadn't before. "So what do? We get smart, we get help, and we move faster than they expect." The next morning, Cole made a call. She stepped outside the motel room, pacing the cracked parking lot while Marcus watched through the window. The conversation lasted nearly 30 minutes. When she came back inside, her expression was thoughtful. "I reached out to a contact at the FBI, retired now, but he spent 20 years working art crime and cultural property cases. His name is Frank DeLuca. He's based in Philadelphia." "Can we trust him?" "I've known Frank for 15 years. He's the reason I got into intelligence work in the first place. If there's anyone who can help us navigate this without getting burned, it's him." "What did he say?" "He wants to meet. Tomorrow, if we can make it." Marcus nodded. "Then we drive to Philadelphia." The drive took 5 hours. Marcus and Cole left before dawn, taking back roads and switching vehicles halfway. Cole had arranged for a rental to be waiting at a gas station outside Harrisburg. Paranoid maybe, but after the black sedan, neither of them was willing to take chances. Frank DeLuca lived in a brownstone in the Italian Market neighborhood, a narrow street lined with produce stands and butcher shops and old men playing cards on folding tables. He answered the door in a cardigan and slippers, a cup of espresso in one hand, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked like someone's grandfather, but his eyes were sharp, alert, taking in everything. "Patricia," he said, pulling Cole into a hug. "It's been too long." "Good to see you, Frank." He turned to Marcus, extending a hand. "And you must be the one with the bunker." "Marcus Wheeler." Frank's grip was firm despite his age. "Come in. We have a lot to discuss." The brownstone was cluttered but clean, bookshelves overflowing with art history texts, framed photographs of Frank with various officials and dignitaries, stacks of files on every available surface. He led them to a sitting room in the back, where a pot of coffee sat waiting on a tray. "Patricia gave me the broad strokes," Frank said, settling into an armchair. "But I want to hear it from you. Start from the beginning." Marcus told him everything. The letter from the lawyer, the inheritance, the bunker and its contents, Harold's journals and the intelligence documents, the map room and the photographs of escaped war criminals. Frank listened without interrupting, sipping his espresso, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When Marcus finished, the room was silent for a long moment. 250 million, Frank said quietly, and documentation of networks that helped Nazis escape prosecution. "Yes, sir." Frank set down his cup and leaned forward. "Do you understand what you're sitting on?" "I'm starting to." "This isn't just about returning stolen property. This is about exposing systems that have been protected for 80 years. Governments, institutions, wealthy families, all of them have reasons to keep this buried." He paused. "You said you saw a black sedan watching you?" "Yes." "Then someone already knows, or suspects." Frank stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. "The question is who, and how much they know." "Any guesses?" Frank turned back to face them. Could be private collectors who've been tracking Harold's activities for years. Could be descendants of the original thieves trying to protect their inheritance. Could be intelligence agencies, ours or foreign, who don't want certain documents to see the light of day. He shrugged. "The honest answer is, I don't know, not yet." "Can you help us find out?" Frank smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "Son, I spent 20 years chasing stolen art and Nazi loot. I've seen cases buried by politicians, evidence destroyed by lawyers, witnesses intimidated into silence. I retired because I got tired of fighting a system that didn't want justice. It wanted convenience." He walked back to his chair and sat down heavily. "But I never stopped caring. And what you've described, the scope of it, the documentation your uncle preserved, this could be the case that finally breaks things open." He met Marcus's eyes. "Yes, I'll help. But you need to understand what you're getting into. Once we start moving, there's no going back. The people who want this buried will come for you. They'll try to discredit you, threaten you, maybe worse." Marcus thought about the explosion in Afghanistan, the hospital, the empty house he came home to, the years of struggling just to survive. "I've already lost everything once," he said quietly. "I'm not afraid of losing it again." Frank studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, let's get to work." Over the next 2 weeks, the team expanded. Frank brought in a lawyer he trusted, a woman named Rachel Martinez who specialized in international restitution cases. She was based in New York, sharp as a razor, with a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys considered impossible. She flew to Pennsylvania to see the bunker herself. When she emerged from the map room 4 hours later, her face was pale. "This is unprecedented," she said. "The documentation alone is worth more than the physical assets. Do you have any idea how many cases have been dismissed because of insufficient provenance? Your uncle created a paper trail that could reopen investigations closed for decades." "That's the idea," Marcus said. Rachel nodded slowly. "I'll need to bring in additional counsel. Specialists in Swiss banking law, European art restitution, international claims processes. This is too big for any one firm." "Do it." She also warned him about the legal complexities he would face. Some of the items in the bunker could be claimed by multiple parties: governments, museums, private families. Some had been legally purchased after the war by collectors who had no idea they were buying stolen goods. Some belonged to families that had been entirely wiped out, with no known descendants. "The process will take years," Rachel said, "maybe decades, and there will be people who fight you every step of the way. Are you prepared for that?" Marcus looked around the bunker. The crates of gold, the paintings on the walls, the filing cabinets filled with stories of lives interrupted. "I didn't ask for this," he said, "but I'm not walking away from it either." The next addition to the team came unexpectedly. Marcus was in Millbrook picking up supplies at the general store when he noticed a young woman watching him from across the street. She was in her late 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and intelligent eyes that seemed to be calculating something. When he walked out of the store, she approached him directly. "You're Marcus Wheeler," she said. It wasn't a question. "Who's asking?" "My name is Sarah Hoffman. I work at the library in Harrisburg. I've been researching Holocaust restitution cases for the past 3 years." She paused. "And my grandmother was a survivor." Marcus studied her. "How do you know who I am?" "Small towns talk, and I've been following stories about recovered Nazi loot for a long time. When I heard someone had inherited the Wheeler property and was asking questions about provenance databases, I put 2 and 2 together." "What do you want?" Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "I want to help. My grandmother lost everything in the war. Her parents, her siblings, her home, everything her family had built for generations. She spent the rest of her life trying to find even one piece of her past. She died 3 years ago without ever recovering anything." Her voice cracked slightly, but she pressed on. "I became a researcher because of her, because I believe that stolen memories deserve to go home. And if what I've heard about your bunker is true, you might have the biggest chance in decades to make that happen." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone. "Give me your number. I'll be in touch." That night, he told Cole about the encounter. "She could be exactly what she says she is," Cole said. "Or she could be working for someone who wants to know what we're doing." "I thought the same thing." "And?" Marcus shrugged. "My gut says she's genuine, but I want you to vet her before we bring her in." Cole nodded. "I'll run a background check. If she's clean, she could be useful. We need someone who understands the research side of this. Databases, archives, provenance tracking. That's not my expertise, and it's definitely not yours." 3 days later, Cole gave the all-clear. Sarah Hoffman was exactly who she claimed to be, a librarian with a master's degree in archival science, a published researcher with articles in academic journals about Holocaust restitution, the granddaughter of a woman named Miriam Hoffman, who had survived Auschwitz and emigrated to the United States in 1947. She had no connections to collectors, governments, or anyone who might have an interest in keeping the bunker's contents hidden. Marcus called her that evening. "You passed inspection," he said. "How soon can you get to Ridgewood Township?" "Tomorrow." She arrived the next morning, driving an old Honda with over 200,000 miles on the odometer. Marcus met her at the edge of the property and led her down the path to the bunker. When she stepped inside the main chamber and saw what it contained, she stopped walking. Her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. She walked slowly through the rows of crates and display cases, tears streaming down her face. She stopped in front of a case containing menorahs, silver, ornate, clearly antique, and pressed her palm against the glass. "My grandmother had one like this," she said quietly. "She described it to me 100 times, gold and silver, handed down for 6 generations. The Nazis took it when they cleared the ghetto." Marcus stood beside her, saying nothing. "These aren't just objects," Sarah continued. "They're proof that these families existed, that they loved and celebrated and built lives worth remembering." She turned to face him. "And you're going to give them back?" "That's the plan." Sarah wiped her eyes. "Then tell me what to do." The team fell into a rhythm. Rachel and her legal partners handled the complex paperwork, filing claims, negotiating with international agencies, preparing for the inevitable lawsuits. Frank used his contacts in law enforcement and intelligence to monitor for threats and gather information about who might be watching. Cole managed security and logistics, and Sarah dove into the archives, cross-referencing Harold's documentation with databases around the world, identifying families who might have claims to the recovered items. Marcus oversaw all of it, splitting his time between the bunker, the motel, and endless phone calls with lawyers, journalists, and officials. His leg ached constantly. He slept 4 or 5 hours a night when he was lucky, but for the first time in years, he felt alive. The work was slow and painstaking. Each item had to be researched individually, its history traced through bills of sale, gallery records, wartime seizure documents, and post-war claims files. Some items had clear provenance and could be matched to specific families within days. Others were mysteries that might take years to unravel. But slowly, carefully, connections began to emerge. A painting by Gustave Courbet was matched to a family in France whose descendants still lived in Lyon. A collection of silver candlesticks was linked to a synagogue in Budapest that had been destroyed during the war but whose congregation had rebuilt in Israel. A diamond necklace was traced to a woman in Amsterdam whose granddaughter was now a professor at Columbia University. Each discovery was a small miracle, a thread connecting the present to a past that had been violently severed. But not everyone was happy about what they were doing. The first warning came 3 weeks after they started. Marcus returned to the motel one evening to find his room had been searched. Nothing was taken, there was nothing to take, but drawers had been opened, the mattress shifted, his few possessions moved in ways that made it clear someone had been there. He called Cole immediately. "We need to move," she said. "Tonight." They relocated to a cabin Frank owned in the mountains, 40 miles from the bunker. It was isolated, defensible, and off the grid. From there, they continued their work while Cole implemented new security protocols. The second warning came a week later. Rachel received a phone call at her office in New York. The caller didn't identify themselves. They simply said, "Drop the Wheeler case. This is your only warning." She reported it to Frank, who escalated to his contacts at the FBI. An investigation was opened, but the call had been made from a burner phone, untraceable. The third warning was more direct. Marcus was driving back to the cabin late one night when a truck appeared behind him, headlights blazing. It followed him for 10 miles, staying close enough to be threatening but never making a move. When Marcus turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, the truck kept going, disappearing into the darkness. But the message was clear. They knew where he was staying. Marcus called an emergency meeting the next morning. Frank, Cole, Rachel, and Sarah gathered around the cabin's kitchen table, faces grim. "Someone is escalating," Cole said. "The motel search was a warning. The phone call to Rachel was a threat. Last night was intimidation." "Do we know who?" Sarah asked. "Not yet, but I have some theories." Frank opened a folder and spread photographs across the table. "These are the names your uncle documented in his journals. War criminals who escaped justice after the war. Most are dead now, but many of them had children, grandchildren, families who built empires on stolen wealth." He pointed to one photograph, an elderly man in a business suit standing outside a corporate headquarters. "This is Heinrich Volker. His father was an SS officer who helped coordinate the seizure of Jewish assets in Austria. The family moved to Brazil after the war, then to the United States in 1963. Heinrich took over the family business, import-export, real estate, investments. Conservative estimates put his net worth at around $400 million. Marcus studied the photograph. "And you think he's involved?" "I think he has the most to lose. If your uncle's documents go public, they could expose his entire family fortune as the proceeds of theft and murder. He has money, connections, and every reason to want this buried. Can we prove it?" "Not yet, but I'm working on it." Cole spoke up. "In the meantime, we need to assume the threats will continue, maybe get worse. Marcus, you should consider relocating permanently, somewhere they can't find you. Marcus shook his head. I'm not running. This isn't about courage. It's about survival. And what happens to the mission if I disappear? Who keeps this going? He looked around the table. I didn't ask for this, but I'm in it now, and I'm not walking away because some Nazi's grandson is trying to scare me. The room was silent. Then Sarah spoke, her voice quiet but firm. My grandmother survived Auschwitz. She lost everyone, her parents, her brothers, her entire village. She walked out of that camp with nothing but the clothes on her back and a number tattooed on her arm. She paused. She spent the rest of her life being afraid to speak up, afraid to draw attention, afraid that if she made too much noise, they would come for her again. She looked at Marcus. She died afraid. I don't want that for you, but I also don't want what she fought to survive to be buried again, because we were too scared to see it through. Marcus met her eyes. Then we see it through. All of us. One by one the others nodded. The weeks that followed were tense. Cole implemented rotating schedules, secure communications, and counter-surveillance protocols. Frank called in favors from former colleagues, building a network of eyes and ears across the region. Rachel hired private security for her office in New York, but the threats didn't stop. Marcus's truck was vandalized one night, tires slashed, windshield cracked, a dead animal was left on the cabin's porch. Anonymous letters arrived at Rachel's office, warning of consequences if the case continued. Each incident was documented, reported to authorities, and added to a growing file. But no arrests were made, no suspects identified. Someone with resources was watching them, testing them, waiting to see if they would break. They didn't break. Instead, they worked harder, faster, more carefully. Sarah identified another 17 families with potential claims to items in the bunker. Rachel began preparing a comprehensive legal filing that would bring the case to international attention. Frank gathered evidence linking Heinrich Volker to a network of former Nazis who had protected each other for decades. And Marcus spent hours in the bunker, surrounded by the ghosts of the past, reading Harold's journals, trying to understand the man who had given his life to this mission. One passage stayed with him more than the others. I have spent so many years alone, Harold had written in 1984. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever understand why. The world moved on. People forgot. They wanted to forget. But I couldn't. I can still see their faces, the families whose photographs I found in looted homes, the children whose toys were packed into crates and shipped to Berlin. They deserved better. They deserved someone who would remember. Marcus closed the journal and sat in silence. He understood now. Harold hadn't been hiding from the world. He had been protecting it, carrying a burden too heavy for anyone to bear alone, waiting for someone who would finally help him set it down. That night, Marcus made a decision. It was time to go public. The press conference was held in Philadelphia, in the conference room of a downtown hotel. Rachel had coordinated with major news outlets, the New York Times, the Washington Post, BBC, CNN, promising an announcement of historic significance. Marcus stood at the podium, his cane leaning against the table beside him, cameras flashing from every direction. He wasn't a public speaker. He wasn't comfortable with attention. But this wasn't about him. It was about the families who had lost everything. About the truth that had been buried for 80 years. About a promise made by a man who had died alone, guarding secrets the world had tried to forget. Marcus cleared his throat and began. My name is Marcus Wheeler. I'm a veteran of the United States Army. 3 years ago, I was injured in Afghanistan. I came home to find that everything I had, my marriage, my savings, my future, had been taken from me. He paused, gathering himself. A few months ago, I inherited a property in rural Pennsylvania from a great uncle I never knew. What I found there has changed my life, and I believe it may change history. He described the bunker, the treasure, the documents. The 50 years Harold had spent protecting evidence that no one wanted to see. He described the paintings and the gold and the personal effects, wedding rings, menorahs, children's toys, stripped from families during the Holocaust. He described his team's efforts to trace these items back to their rightful owners, and he announced that everything recoverable would be returned. "This is not about money," Marcus said. "This is not about fame or recognition. This is about justice, about remembering the people who were erased and giving their descendants something the war tried to take, proof that their families existed, proof that they mattered." He looked directly into the cameras. "And to those who have tried to stop us, who have threatened us, intimidated us, tried to bury this truth again, I want you to know, we are not afraid. The truth is coming out, and nothing you do will stop it." The room erupted. Questions shouted from every direction, cameras flashing, reporters pushing forward. Marcus stepped back from the podium, his heart pounding. It was done. There was no going back now. The world was watching. The morning after the press conference, Marcus woke to a world that had completely changed. His phone had died overnight from the sheer volume of calls, texts, and notifications. Cole had already fielded over 200 media requests by the time the sun came up. Rachel's office in New York was overwhelmed with inquiries from law firms, government agencies, and families across the globe who believed they might have claims to items in the bunker. The story had gone viral. Every major news outlet in the world was running it. Veteran discovers $250 million Nazi treasure. Forgotten bunker reveals stolen Holocaust artifacts. One man's mission to return what the war stole. The headlines varied, but the message was the same. This was the discovery of a generation, and Marcus Wheeler was at the center of it. He sat in the cabin that morning, staring at his dead phone, trying to process what had happened. 3 months ago, he had been a broken man living in a crumbling apartment, wondering if life would ever give him a reason to keep going. Now his face was on television screens around the world, and strangers were calling him a hero. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted, overwhelmed, and more than a little terrified. Cole walked in with a fresh pot of coffee and a stack of printed emails. "You need to see these," she said, setting them on the table. Marcus flipped through the pages. Messages from Holocaust museums, restitution organizations, government officials, university researchers, all wanting to help, to contribute, to be part of what he was building. But mixed in with the support were other messages, anonymous threats, warnings, promises of consequences. "The vultures are circling," Cole said, "but so are the Allies. The question is whether we can move fast enough to stay ahead of both." Frank arrived an hour later with news. "Heinrich Volker disappeared last night," he said. "Private jet to Zurich. From there, who knows? But my contacts say he's running scared." "Scared enough to stop causing problems?" Marcus asked. "Scared enough to make mistakes." Frank sat down heavily, accepting a cup of coffee from Cole. His family's attorneys have already started filing motions to block any claims against assets they hold. They're arguing that the statute of limitations has expired, that the documentation is insufficient, that the chain of custody is compromised. Will any of that work? Some of it might. The legal battles will take years, but here's the thing. Public opinion is on our side now. The whole world is watching. And people like Volker, they don't do well in the spotlight. They thrive in shadows, in back rooms, in places where deals can be made quietly. Frank smiled grimly. "We've dragged them into the light. That's half the battle right there." Rachel flew in from New York that afternoon for an emergency strategy session. "The response has been overwhelming," she said, spreading documents across the cabin's kitchen table. "We've received inquiries from over 300 families in the first 24 hours. Some have documentation supporting their claims. Others are going on family stories passed down through generations." "How do we handle that volume?" Sarah asked. "We're going to need help, a lot of it." Rachel pulled out a folder. I've reached out to 6 major restitution organizations. 3 have already agreed to partner with us. They'll provide researchers, legal support, and infrastructure to process claims. What about the items with no clear owner? Marcus asked. The stuff that can't be traced to specific families. Rachel nodded slowly. That's more complicated. Some of it may end up in museums. Some may be sold, with proceeds going to Holocaust education and survivor support organizations, and some, like the intelligence documents, may need to be handled by government agencies. The FBI has already reached out, Frank added. They want access to Harold's files on escaped war criminals. Some of those names are connected to cases that were never closed. Marcus thought about that. His great-uncle had spent 50 years documenting crimes that no one wanted to prosecute. Now, finally, that documentation might lead to justice, even if the criminals themselves were long dead. Give them what they need, Marcus said, but make sure we have copies of everything. I don't want any of this to disappear into some government filing cabinet. The first restitution ceremony happened 6 weeks later. It was held in a small synagogue in Brooklyn, attended by family members, community leaders, and a carefully selected group of journalists. Marcus had insisted on keeping it intimate. This wasn't about spectacle, it was about healing. The family's name was Goldstein. Their great-grandmother, Esther, had lived in Vienna before the war. She had been a concert pianist, beloved in her community, known for her Sunday afternoon recitals. When the Nazis came, they took everything: her home, her savings, her piano, her life. She had died in Treblinka in 1943. But one thing had survived: a silver Kiddush cup that had belonged to her family for 7 generations. It had been seized during the raid on her home and shipped to Berlin with thousands of other looted items. Somehow, it had ended up in Harold's bunker, catalogued and preserved for 8 decades. Now it was going home. Marcus stood at the front of the synagogue, the Kiddush cup resting on a velvet cushion before him. Across from him sat 3 generations of the Goldstein family: children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of a woman none of them had ever met. I didn't know Esther Goldstein, Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. I never heard her play piano. I never saw her smile. But I know she was loved. I know she was remembered. And I know that what was taken from her deserves to be returned. He picked up the Kiddush cup and walked slowly toward the family. The eldest, a woman in her 80s named Ruth, rose to meet him. Her hands trembled as she reached out. My mother told me stories about this cup, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She said it was used at every Sabbath dinner, every Passover, every celebration. She said her mother would polish it until it shined like a mirror. Ruth took the cup and pressed it to her chest, sobbing. Thank you, she managed. Thank you for bringing her back to us. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. He stepped back and watched as the family gathered around, touching the cup, crying, embracing each other. This was why he had done it. Not for the money, not for the fame. For this. For the chance to give people back a piece of what had been stolen. The ceremonies continued over the following months. In Paris, a painting by Renoir was returned to the descendants of a gallery owner who had been murdered in Auschwitz. In Amsterdam, a collection of family photographs was given to the grandchildren of a couple who had hidden Jewish families during the occupation before being betrayed and killed. In Tel Aviv, a Torah scroll was presented to a congregation that had been founded by survivors of a destroyed synagogue in Poland. Each ceremony was different. Each family had their own story, their own grief, their own way of processing what had been lost and what was being returned. But the common thread was always the same: gratitude. Not just for the objects themselves, but for the acknowledgement. For someone finally saying, "This happened. Your family mattered. And the world has not forgotten." Marcus attended as many ceremonies as he could. His leg made travel difficult, and the constant attention was exhausting, but he felt obligated to be there. These families deserved to see the face of the man who had found their heirlooms. They deserved to know that someone cared. But not everyone was grateful. The lawsuits began arriving within weeks of the press conference. Heinrich Volker's family filed first, claiming that several items in the bunker had been legally purchased by their ancestors after the war, and that Marcus had no right to return them to other parties. Their attorneys argued that the original owners had been compensated through post-war reparations programs and that any further claims were invalid. It was a lie, and everyone knew it. But lies backed by expensive lawyers can tie up courts for years. Other suits followed. A museum in Switzerland claimed that 3 paintings in the collection had been donated to them in 1952 and demanded their return. A private collector in London insisted that a piece of jewelry had been sold to his grandfather in good faith and that he was the rightful owner. Rachel handled the legal battles with fierce determination. She assembled a team of specialists in international restitution law, filed counter-motions, gathered evidence, and prepared for what she warned would be a decade-long fight. "They're trying to exhaust us," she told Marcus during one late-night strategy session. "They know they can't win on the merits, so they're trying to drain our resources and our patience." "Will it work?" Rachel smiled grimly. "Not if I have anything to say about it." The threats continued too. Marcus received a package at the cabin one morning containing a bullet and a note with 2 words: "Last chance." Cole immediately escalated security. Armed guards were posted around the property. Marcus began traveling with protection. The FBI opened a formal investigation into the threats, though progress was slow. But Marcus refused to stop, refused to hide, refused to let fear dictate his actions. "They want me to quit," he told Cole one night, staring out at the dark forest surrounding the cabin. "They think if they scare me enough, I'll walk away." "Will you?" Marcus turned to face her. "My grandfather taught me that a man's word is the only thing he truly owns. I made a promise, to Harold, to myself, to all those families. I'm not breaking it because some Nazi's grandson sends me threatening letters." Cole nodded slowly. "Then we keep going." "We keep going." The breakthrough came 7 months after the press conference. Frank had been working his contacts relentlessly, tracing the network of former Nazis who had protected each other after the war. He had identified bank accounts, shell companies, real estate holdings, all connected to families who had built fortunes on stolen wealth. But the key piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A man named Albert Fischer, 89 years old, living in a nursing home in Argentina, reached out through an intermediary. He claimed to have worked for Heinrich Volker's father in the 1950s, helping to launder stolen assets and establish the family's legitimate business empire. Now, facing his own mortality, he wanted to confess. Frank flew to Buenos Aires to interview him. The conversation lasted 3 days. When Frank returned, he brought with him over 200 pages of testimony, along with documents Fischer had kept hidden for decades: ledgers, correspondence, account numbers. "This is it," Frank said, spreading the documents across the table. "This proves that the Volker fortune was built entirely on stolen Nazi gold. We can trace the money from Berlin to Zurich, to Brazil, to the United States. Every dollar they have is dirty." Rachel's eyes widened. "This changes everything. We can file criminal referrals, freeze assets, force settlements." "Can we actually put anyone in prison?" Marcus asked. Frank shook his head slowly. "The original criminals are dead. Their children and grandchildren claim ignorance. But we can destroy them financially, take away everything they built on blood money, and redistribute it to the people it was stolen from." Marcus thought about that. It wasn't perfect justice. The men who had committed these crimes would never face a courtroom. But their legacy, the wealth and power they had passed down, could still be dismantled. "Do it," he said. "Take everything they have." The legal assault on the Volker family began immediately. Rachel filed motions to freeze their assets pending investigation. Frank provided evidence to federal prosecutors who opened a formal case into money laundering and tax fraud. Journalists who had been following the story published exposés detailing the family's Nazi connections. Heinrich Volker, hiding in Switzerland, released a statement denying any wrongdoing. But the evidence was overwhelming. Within weeks, banks began closing his accounts. Business partners distanced themselves. The empire his father had built on stolen wealth began to crumble. It wasn't just the Volkers. Other families connected to the network faced similar scrutiny. Some settled quietly, writing checks to restitution funds in exchange for avoiding public exposure. Others fought, but the combination of legal pressure and public attention made their positions increasingly untenable. By the end of the year, over $40 million had been recovered from Nazi-connected families and redistributed to survivors and their descendants. It was a fraction of what had been stolen. But it was something. It was progress. It was justice, however imperfect and delayed. The bunker itself became a different kind of landmark. After the initial items had been removed and catalogued, after the families had received their heirlooms, after the legal claims had been processed, what remained was the space itself. The concrete walls, the steel doors, the map room with its pins and photographs. Marcus had offers to sell the property. Developers wanted to build luxury homes on the land. Collectors wanted to buy the bunker and turn it into a private museum. A Hollywood producer wanted to option the rights to his story. He turned them all down. Instead, with guidance from Sarah and support from Frank's contacts in the museum world, Marcus transformed the bunker into something else. A memorial and education center dedicated to preserving the memory of what had been lost and what had been recovered. The Whitaker Center for Holocaust Remembrance opened its doors on the second anniversary of the press conference. The ceremony was larger than Marcus would have liked. Dignitaries, journalists, survivors, and their families from around the world. But he understood that this moment belonged to more than just him. He stood at the entrance to the bunker, now fitted with proper lighting, climate control, and museum-quality displays. The map room had been preserved exactly as Harold had left it, a testament to one man's lonely crusade for justice. "My great-uncle spent 50 years protecting this place," Marcus said to the gathered crowd. "He gave up everything, family, connection, the simple pleasures of ordinary life, because he believed that some truths were too important to let die." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "I didn't understand that when I first came here. I was a broken man, angry at the world, convinced that honor and sacrifice meant nothing. But Harold taught me different. He taught me that what we do matters, that the choices we make ripple outward in ways we can never predict." Marcus gestured toward the bunker's open doors. "This place isn't just about the past, it's about the future, about teaching new generations what happened during the war and why we can never allow it to happen again. About reminding people that the treasures stolen from Jewish families weren't just objects, they were memories, proof of lives lived and loved." He took a deep breath. "And it's about hope. Because if one forgotten veteran in a bunker in Pennsylvania can make a difference, can help return what was stolen, can expose crimes that were buried for 80 years, can give families back a piece of their history, then maybe any of us can. Maybe all of us can." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. He was thinking about Harold, about the old man who had died alone, guarding secrets the world had tried to forget, about the letter waiting in the bunker, addressed to a nephew he had never met. "I hope I did you proud," Marcus whispered. "I hope this was enough." The personal transformation came more slowly than the public one. For months after the press conference, Marcus had been so focused on the mission, the ceremonies, the lawsuits, the threats, that he hadn't stopped to think about himself, about what all of this meant for his own life. But gradually, as the chaos settled into routine, he began to notice changes. The bitterness that had consumed him for years, the anger at his ex-wife, at Kevin, at the system that had chewed him up and spit him out, had faded. Not disappeared entirely, but diminished, replaced by something else, purpose maybe, or just the simple exhaustion of carrying hatred for too long. He thought about them sometimes, about the life he had lost, about the betrayal that had broken him. But he no longer wanted revenge, no longer fantasized about confrontation. They had taken what they wanted from him, and in doing so, they had set him on a path that led here, to this bunker, this mission, this second chance. Maybe he should thank them. Maybe their betrayal had been the best thing that ever happened to him. Or maybe that was too generous. Maybe they were just selfish people who had done selfish things, and he had survived despite them, not because of them. Either way, he was done letting them define him. The leg never fully healed. The doctors had warned him from the beginning. The damage was too extensive, the reconstruction too complex. He would always walk with a limp, always need the cane, always feel the metal rods shifting beneath his skin when the weather changed. But Marcus had made peace with that too. His body was a map of his journey. The scars from Afghanistan, the aches from years of service, the constant reminder of what he had survived. He wasn't whole, but he was alive, and he was doing something that mattered. That was enough. The foundation was established on the 3rd anniversary of Marcus's discovery. He had never intended to keep any of the treasure for himself. From the beginning, his plan had been to return what could be returned and donate the rest. But Rachel and Frank had convinced him that some of the legitimately obtained items, war trophies with clear provenance, artifacts without traceable owners, could be sold to fund something larger, something that would outlast him. The Wheeler Veterans Foundation was born from that vision. Its mission was simple: to support veterans who had fallen through the cracks. The men and women who came home broken, like Marcus had, who lost their families, their homes, their sense of purpose, who struggled with injuries, addiction, unemployment, despair. The foundation provided housing assistance, job training, mental health support, and community programs. It partnered with the VA and private organizations to fill gaps in the existing system. And it operated on a simple principle that Marcus had learned the hard way. Sometimes the most important thing you can give someone isn't money. It's the knowledge that they matter, that someone sees them, that they haven't been forgotten. Marcus threw himself into the work with the same intensity he had brought to the bunker mission. He visited veterans in hospitals and homeless shelters. He testified before Congress about the failures of the system. He used his unexpected fame to draw attention to causes that had been ignored for too long. He wasn't comfortable in the spotlight. Never would be. But he had learned that comfort wasn't the point. The point was doing what needed to be done, regardless of how it felt. The letters came from all over the world. Some were from families who had received their heirlooms back, expressing gratitude that Marcus could barely process. An elderly woman in Israel who had wept when she opened the package containing her grandmother's wedding ring. A man in Australia whose entire understanding of his family history had changed when he received photographs from the bunker. A teenager in Germany who had learned about her great-grandparents for the first time through documents Marcus's team had uncovered. Other letters came from veterans, men and women who had seen Marcus's story and felt hope for the first time in years, who reached out to the foundation for help and found it, who wanted Marcus to know that his example had inspired them to keep going. And some letters came from strangers, people who had no connection to the war, no claim to any treasure, but who had been moved by what Marcus had done, who wanted him to know that his choices mattered, that the world was better because he had refused to walk away. Marcus kept every letter in a box by his bed. On nights when the pain was bad, when the memories of Afghanistan crept in, when he doubted whether any of it made a difference, he would read them, remind himself why he was doing this, why it was worth the cost. The final ceremony happened 5 years after the discovery. It was held at the bunker, now the Whitaker Center, on a cool autumn afternoon. The trees surrounding the property had turned gold and crimson, and the air smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves. Nearly 1,000 people had gathered, survivors and their descendants, veterans from Marcus's foundation, journalists and dignitaries, friends and allies who had been part of the journey from the beginning. Cole stood near the entrance, arms crossed, scanning the crowd with her usual vigilance. Frank sat in the front row, looking older than he had 5 years ago, but still sharp-eyed and alert. Rachel stood off to the side, conferring quietly with her legal team, and Sarah had become the center's director, overseeing its transformation into a world-class educational institution. Marcus walked to the podium slowly, his cane tapping against the stone path. His leg ached, as it always did, but he barely noticed any more. He looked out at the faces before him, strangers and friends, connected by a thread that stretched back 80 years to a war that had almost destroyed civilization. 5 years ago, he began, I was a broken man. I had lost everything I thought defined me, my career, my marriage, my sense of purpose. I was living in a one-room apartment, wondering if my life would ever mean anything again. He paused, letting the words settle. Then I got a letter, an inheritance from an uncle I had never met, a bunker hidden in the hills of Pennsylvania containing secrets that had been buried for decades. Marcus looked toward the bunker entrance, where Harold's original steel door still stood, polished now but unchanged. My great-uncle, Harold Wheeler, spent 50 years of his life protecting this place. He gave up everything, love, family, connection, because he believed that some truths were too important to let die. He waited his whole life for someone to help him finish what he started. Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He chose me. I don't know why. Maybe because I was the last one left. Maybe because he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. But whatever the reason, he gave me something more valuable than any treasure. He looked out at the crowd. He gave me purpose. The applause began, but Marcus raised his hand. Over the past 5 years, we have returned over 400 items to their rightful owners. We have identified nearly 1,000 families with claims to artifacts in this collection. We have exposed networks of corruption that protected war criminals for generations, and we have redistributed over $100 million from those who stole it to those it was stolen from. He let that sink in. But this isn't about numbers. It isn't about money. It's about memory, about honoring the people who were erased by history and giving their descendants something the war tried to take, proof that their families existed, proof that they mattered. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, the brass key that had opened the bunker 5 years ago. This key changed my life. It led me to a fortune I never expected and a mission I never asked for. But more than that, it led me to all of you. He held up the key so everyone could see. Today, I'm donating this key to the Whitaker Center. It will be displayed at the entrance to the bunker so that everyone who visits will remember where this journey began. He walked slowly to a display case that had been prepared near the bunker entrance. Inside, on a velvet cushion, was a small brass plaque that read, "The key that changed everything." Marcus placed the key on the cushion and stepped back. Harold Wheeler believed that one person could make a difference, he said. He proved it, and I believe, that what we've built here proves it too. He turned to face the crowd one final time. The work isn't finished. There are still families searching for their heirlooms, still crimes that have never been prosecuted, still wounds that haven't healed. But we've shown that it's possible, that even after 80 years, justice can find a way. Marcus smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened his weathered face. Thank you, all of you, for believing that this mattered, for standing with me when it would have been easier to walk away, for proving that the world hasn't forgotten. He stepped back from the podium. The crowd rose to their feet. The applause was thunderous, not the polite acknowledgement of a speech well delivered, but something deeper. Gratitude, admiration, recognition of what had been accomplished. Marcus stood at the edge of the gathering, watching as people embraced, as tears were shed, as stories were shared. Survivors held their grandchildren. Veterans from his foundation stood straighter than they had in years. Journalists scribbled notes, trying to capture a moment that seemed to defy description. Cole appeared at his side. "Hell of a speech," she said. Marcus shrugged. "I just told the truth." "That's what made it good." She paused, studying his face. "How do you feel?" Marcus considered the question. His leg throbbed. His back ached. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. But beneath all of that, there was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. "I feel like maybe I did something that mattered," he said quietly. "Like maybe all of it, the war, the injury, the betrayal, maybe it led somewhere worth going." Cole nodded slowly. "It did. You know that, right? What you've done here, it's going to outlast all of us." Marcus looked at the bunker, at the center that now bore Harold's name, at the crowds of people whose lives had been touched by what they had built. "I hope so," he said. "I really hope so." That night, after the crowds had gone, after the caterers had packed up and the journalists had filed their stories, Marcus walked the grounds alone. The bunker was quiet now. The map room preserved behind glass, the display cases filled with photographs and documents and the few items that had no traceable owners. Harold's journals were prominently featured, open to pages that told the story of a man who had given everything for a cause no one else believed in. Marcus stopped at the display case near the entrance. The brass key rested on its velvet cushion, catching the light from the overhead fixtures. He pressed his palm against the glass. "We did it, Harold," he whispered. "We finished what you started." There was no response, no ghostly whisper, no sign from beyond, just the silence of the bunker and the weight of everything it represented. But Marcus didn't need a sign. He knew, somehow, that Harold was at peace, that the burden he had carried for 50 years had finally been set down. And Marcus had found something he thought he had lost forever. Purpose, connection, the knowledge that his life meant something. He walked out of the bunker and stood at the edge of the clearing, looking up at the stars. The night was cold and clear, the sky thick with constellations his grandfather had taught him to identify decades ago. He thought about his grandfather, about Harold, about all the men who had served in that war, who had sacrificed everything to stop an evil that seemed unstoppable. He thought about the families he had helped, the treasures he had returned, the justice he had fought for, and he thought about himself, the man he had been before, bitter, broken, convinced that the world owed him something, and the man he had become, scarred, yes, exhausted, yes, but whole in a way he had never been before. "Thank you," he whispered to the night, to Harold, to his grandfather, to everyone who had helped him along the way. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin, his cane tapping softly against the path, ready for whatever came next. Marcus Wheeler had entered that bunker looking for answers about his past. He had found something far more valuable, a future worth living. And in the end, that was the greatest treasure of all. The story of Marcus Wheeler spread far beyond Pennsylvania. Documentaries were made, books were written. Schools incorporated the Whitaker Center into their curriculum. And every year, on the anniversary of the bunker's discovery, families gathered from around the world to honor what had been lost and what had been found. But for Marcus, the greatest legacy wasn't the fame or the recognition. It was the quiet knowledge that he had done something right, that when the world had given him a chance to walk away, he had chosen to stay. He had been betrayed by the people he trusted most. He had lost everything he thought defined him. He had spent years wondering if his life would ever mean anything again. And then a forgotten bunker in the hills of Pennsylvania had given him the answer. Not wealth, not revenge, not even justice exactly. Just purpose, just the chance to matter. And sometimes that's all any of us really need. Anyone can find redemption if they're willing to dig deep enough. And anyone can change the world if they refuse to look away from what needs to be done. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, courage, and second chances. Click now to keep the journey going with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that even the most forgotten among us still have the power to change everything.